Square Enix and Nintendo's 1996 rollout of Super Mario RPG may have seemed odd at the time, but it gave way to a long line of unforgettable RPG. Nintendo had some of their largest successes throughout the 80s and 90s, but one genre that they just couldn't seem to break into was the RPG. At the time, RPGs were crushing it in Japan, but in the States, we were a bit behind in the scene. Nintendo tried getting players in the US to jump on board the RPG hype, but after the lackluster debut of Dragon Warrior, things went quiet on the North American Nintendo RPG front. As time went on, RPGs like EarthBound, Final Fantasy, Illusion of Gaia, and a number of others began to pop up. Some RPG titles garnered okay sales numbers, but they just didn't seem to live up to Nintendo's hopeful sales numbers. So, in a last-ditch attempt before Pokemon was later birthed, Nintendo decided to go more well-known characters for a newer RPG game with a developer that had a solid track record in the space. Nintendo and Square partnered up on Super Mario RPG, which would in turn end up being Square's last SNES game released in America. Square and Nintendo actually weren't on the best of terms at the time, and while it's hard to put together the exact events that led up to this bad blood, many point to the brash outbursts from Nintendo's former president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and him going so far as saying RPG fans were depressed gamers who like to sit alone in their dark rooms. But this questionable statement actually didn't come out until years after the release of Super Mario RPG. What really caused this rift between Nintendo and Square was Square's involvement in convincing other publishers to bail from Nintendo while bad-mouthing them to the press. Nintendo had their hands full at the time working on the N64 along with Super Mario 64. This meant that they had to be a bit more hands-off with the development of Super Mario RPG, and Square had more creative control over the title. This might explain why the game diverges so much from what you'd expect a Mario RPG at that time to be like. The game blazes its own path and introduces many characters entirely unique to it. The game starts off presenting Bowser as the villain like we had seen many times before, but quickly he's overshadowed by the game's true villain, leading Bowser to actually join your squad. Princess Peach sees a shift from the damsel in distress to become a highly valuable party member. The game's battle system was quite unique for its time as well. Because RPGs had a history of underperforming in American markets, Square decided to give the player more control while battling. Timed attacks were revolutionary. Players had to carefully time button presses to deal additional damage, which in turn felt less like watching an auto battle take place and incentivized players to remain engaged with what was happening on screen. This mechanic would later go on to debut in many different RPGs, becoming somewhat of a mainstay throughout the Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi series. Mario RPG debuted at a difficult time when Sony's PlayStation was pushing 3D heavily. Because the N64 wasn't yet ready for release, the game did what it could with what was available to it at the time. It featured an isometric style viewpoint along with a graphical style similar to the massively successful Donkey Kong Country. The top-down view and graphical style gave Super Mario RPG a 3D sort of feel. This isometric view makes some gameplay elements a bit difficult to master. Super Mario RPG would later go on and give birth to the Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi series, which eventually even had Gino make a guest appearance. To this day, Super Mario RPG still has a solid cult following, and for good reason. The spin-offs that evolved led to many great games. Whether Nintendo has any plans to port Super Mario RPG to the Switch remains yet to be seen, but for now, you can still fire up your old SNES and relive this classic that spawned many great games. Happy playing!